All right, thank you for being here. Where is the clicker? Thank you. So my name is Negro. I work at the New York Fed. I'm very honored to be here. I want to thank JAP and the Econometrics Journal for having this presentation at this special session. The title is Recent Developments in Forecasting with DSGE Models, and it's the presentation is joint work with a bunch of people at the New York Fed, as well as Mark Giannoni and Erica Muskowski, who are in Dallas and HBS, respectively. Oh, and whatever I'm going to say are just my views and not those of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York or the Federal Reserve System, importantly. Okay, so the questions that I am going to address here are the following. One, did modern structural macroeconometrics models, DSGE, live up to their promise? So about 15 years ago, a little more, Ralph Wouters and Frank Smets came up with their seminal work where they took the Cristiano, Eichenbaum, and Evans model to the data, and they showed that it forecasted about as well, if not better, than a Bayesian VAR. That, for macroeconomists, that was arguably an important result because since Prescott, in the 1980s, people thought, okay, you can do macroeconomic theory. At best, you can calibrate those models, but you can just get ideas. Those are not models that you can take to the data, let alone forecast well with them. And they show that, well, instead, you can do that. So, over the past 15 years, my sample is not that long because for the reason I'll tell you, but we actually, at central banks, did forecast and use these models. And so I think it's a legitimate question to ask, how did we do? So to do a postmortem. And the first part of the paper is going to do exactly that, okay? The second part of the paper is going to ask, well, what drives the results of these postmortem? What feature helped or hindered macroeconomic models? And if anything will remain from this presentation, I hope it is the fact that not all DSGs are the same. Okay. I am going to talk about the forecasting performance of DSGE models during the post-Great Recession periods. I'm going to do that because that was the period when we started forecasting with it at the New York Fed. We started in late 2010, and we're still forecasting with it. The post-Great Recession period was a challenging period, obviously very challenging for those who lost their home or their jobs, but also challenging for forecasters. Why? Well, because the very deep recession, it was a Great Recession, was not followed by a swift recovery, unlike in previous post-war deep recessions, but instead generated, as you probably all know, very large and persistent output gaps. One. Two, these gaps, however, did not lead to deflation as a traditional Phillips curve relationship would have implied. That phenomenon has been called by Koibon and Gorodnichenko the missing deflation. Three, what Barbara talked about, monetary policy was totally different in this period than what it was, when these models are actually estimated on the data on which they are estimated. We had the zero lower bound and unconventional monetary policy. So for all of these reasons, this was not a model where you would expect DSGE models to do that well. Okay, so how did we do? So I'm gonna, as I said, the first part of the exercise is gonna show a real-time forecasting accuracy exercise using the forecasts that were produced by the New York Fed DSGE model. These we actually stick our neck out with our forecasts, that we started publishing them in 2014. Now we publish them 4 times a year. Before then, we didn't. However, and by the way, this is what our post where we publish a forecast look like. Before then, we didn't. However, now the memos where our forecasts were sent to the FOMC for 2011 and 2012 are available on the board website. So you can check that the forecasts I'm going to show you are exactly those that we showed the FOMC at the time. Okay, so how did, okay, and then the second part, as I said, we ask what features. In order to ask what features, obviously, we want to keep things constant and change a feature of the time, right? There's only one New York Fed model that we used, but we want to know, well, did financial friction matters? Did using expectations about future interest rates matter? Did using nowcast matter? What features matter for forecasting? And so in order to address that question, we're going to do a pseudo real-time out-of-sample forecasting accuracy. Pseudo real-time means that you use the real-time data that we would have used, but of course you go back in time and change the model. Okay? So how did DSGE models fare? Probably many of you may think that this is the answer. Certainly that guy who was a Bloomberg journalist think that it's the case, right? As you can read there, most people outside the discipline who take a look at this model immediately think they're kind of a joke, blah, blah, blah. Their forecasting performance is abysmal. Well, let's go look. Okay, first thing I want to say is, and I said it, but I want to stress it, that in most papers that you read or in the handbook of forecasting, those are all pseudo out-of-sample exercises, right? Again, people, if they're diligent, they use real-time data, whatever, but still, you go back in time and you can always be accused of changing the model so that you produce, reasonable forecasting accuracy. The root mean square errors, and I'm going to show you in a second, that thing shows root mean square errors, are instead derived from actual forecasts. Those are forecasts that we publish either on the blog or in the various memo, and then we ask ourselves how we did. So there's nobody can say, oh, you guys changed the model to, no, that's what we used, that's what we produced. Okay, what I am showing is on the top, root mean square errors for output growth. For the first 2 panels, from 1 to 8 quarters ahead, the middle N here telling me how many observations I have. And this is the red is the root mean square errors from the New York Fed DSGE models, and the blue are the root mean square errors from the blue chip forecasters. In the US, there are various surveys. The blue chip is one of them, possibly the most popular. So the bottom line is that they're the same. So the New York Fed DSGE model during the recovery from the Great Recession forecasted about as accurately from 1 through 8 quarters ahead, where 1 is the nowcast, as basically the consensus blue chip. Notice, by the way, that the consensus blue chip is an average of forecasting, a pooling. So we all know that pools generally performs better than individuals. So if the DSGE model performs as well as a pool, well, it's not doing that bad. Here is the same thing with SPF. It does a little worse at the beginning, but that's mostly because SPF often have an informational advantage. By the way, in choosing this forecast, we always chose a forecast that anteceded the blue chip forecast, right? The respective blue chip forecast, so that the DSGE had no informational advantage. And here the gap is actually pretty bad because more often than not, the SPF know have one more quarter release of data relative than the New York Fed DSG model. But anyway, the bottom line, no, my God, let me. The bottom line is that at least, from 1 through 8 quarters ahead, if you look at private forecasters, the New York Fed DSG model did as well. But perhaps the most interesting comparison of all is this one to the right, where we compare the forecasting accuracy for GDP and core PCE inflation relative to the FOMC's own summary of economic projections. So these are our bosses. And on the x-axis, I don't have quarters anymore, but I have years. So this is a current year, next year, 3 years ahead, 4 years ahead. Although here you see that we have very few observations, so you should ignore that. The gap between the RMSEs of the New York Fed DSG model and that of the SCP is pretty staggering. It is quite large. For inflation, the New York Fed does a little worse, up to 2 years ahead, but about the same, if not a little better, for 3 years ahead. So why did the DSG model forecast better, arguably, than the summary of economic projection? In order to answer that question, I'm going to show you some real-time forecasts that we made at the time, and in particular in 2011 Q1. So in this plot, this is output, this is inflation. The black is the data that we had at the time. The red is the New York Fed DSG forecast, and the dash is the ex-post revised data. And finally, the blue dots were the central tendency of the summary of economic projections. So basically where the majority of FOMC's forecasts lied. Well, better? Sorry about that. Okay. Got too excited about DSG models. So what I want to, so you see that the SCP was forecasting basically a very swift recovery from the Great Recession, right? And I guess what they were thinking is, well, when was the last time that we had a deep recession? That was about 82, right, with the fall to disinflation. And the US economy bounced back pretty rapidly, closed the gap pretty rapidly. Since the gap was big, well, if you want to close it, you get better grow at 4%. Okay? The DSG model instead projected a very slow recovery from the financial crisis, a result that is reminiscent of that of Reiner and Rogoff, although obviously in a very different context. As I will show you in a second, this is because it attributed the crisis to financial shock. I have a litany of forecasts. The bottom line is that basically the SCP over time adjusted down toward the New York Fed DSG model in terms of forecasting. But let me move on to understanding why the forecasts were what they were. What drove that? Why did the DSG model forecasted a very sluggish recovery from the financial crisis? So in order to address that question, I'm a disaster here. In order to address that question, maybe I'm going to look at basically two models. One is a prototypical Smith and Vadras model. It uses 7 observables that you all know: the growth rate of output, consumption, investment, real wages, hours, GDP deflator inflation and the federal funds rate. And the other is what I'm going to call SWFF, which is SW plus the financial frictions. In terms of observables, it uses two, one that doesn't matter and one that does. The one that doesn't matter is long-run inflation expectation. The one that does matter a lot is the BAA Treasury spread. And in terms of frictions, that is, in terms of how the model works, what this SWFF has is financial frictions. Okay. All right. So let's focus on the top panel. Here I am showing, now this is a pseudo out-of-sample exercise, the results, the comparison between blue chip and these SWFF root mean square errors. Basically, and for the same period that I showed you earlier, which is January 2011, January 2016. Basically the same as the New York Fed DSGE model, which is not surprising because the two are very close. In terms of inflation, this is not core, this is GDP deflator inflation, so the root mean square errors look a little different from before, but the bottom line is the same, about the same as the blue chip. Notice very importantly that for the federal funds rate, the two lines are overlapped. Why is that? Because we use expectations for the federal funds rate in estimating the model. This is very important because, you know, when you do policy analysis and you forecast for policy analysis, right, you don't want to produce a forecast where the interest rates, you know, does something very different than what the central bank has announced it will do. In particular, this is a zero-bound period where, you know, the expectation for the interest rates was to be at zero for a number of years. So it doesn't make sense to produce a forecast where the interest rate rises to 5% because then your president or your boss says, hey, this is not very useful for me. I want, okay, you got it. So we condition on interest rate expectations in producing this forecast, and this is simply done by augmenting the measurement equation, DSGE is our state-based model, with survey expectations, so in this case the blue chip, of for the federal funds rate. Okay? All right, so this is a model with financial friction. This is a plain Smith-Water, again, without financial friction. And you see that the root mean square errors, especially for output, but also for inflation, are really much worse. So when I said that DSGE models are not all the same, well, that's exactly what I have in mind. So why is that the case? Well, or what's wrong with Smith-Water, not with Raf and Frank, but with the model in this period? These are the forecasts that I showed you earlier. They're the same stuff. Solid is past data, dash is revised data, and the red is the model's forecast. You see that for output, these guys forecast about 4 to 5% growth. Roughly speaking, the summary of economic projection on the median was forecasting, so this model, just like the SCP, is forecasting a quick recovery, expects the gaps to close very fast and produces very fast growth. Okay? In addition, if you also notice that in this projection, we're not conditioning on the expectation for the federal funds rate to stay at zero. If you condition, you get an even faster growth. You get growth between 6 and 7%, so pretty crazy. Certainly not what happened afterwards. Why is that? Well, I'm going to address this question in a second. Okay? The financial friction model instead expects the gap to close very slowly, meaning its forecast for output growth is quite subdued, and when we condition on interest rate expectations, right, these are the same, the forecasts don't change that much. That is, it doesn't suffer as much from what we call the forward guidance puzzle. So let me address the first point. Why is Metz and Wouters forecasting a swift recovery from the Great Recession, and the model with financial friction does not? Let's see, first of all, these are structural models, so you can interpret the past, in this case GDP growth, during the Great Recession, in light of the various shocks that hit the model. There are many colors here and too many shocks, but the most important here is the shock in blue, which basically rises spreads in this model. Metz and Wouters also has a spread, although it doesn't use it as an observable, but also has a shock. What it does not have is the mechanism, the dynamic mechanism given by the financial friction. You see that both models attribute to the spread shock a large chunk of the drop in output during the Great Recession, the model with financial friction more, which kind of makes a lot of sense in light of what happened in the Great Recession. But for the Metz and Wouters model, also monetary policy and marginal efficiency of investment shocks is like blue matters. The key is in the impulse responses that in these models are very different. So here I'm showing the impulse responses of real GDP growth. So let's look at the model with financial friction, and let's look at the risk premium shock. You see that in terms of growth rate, output goes down by 0.6% for 1 standard deviation shock, but then keeps on declining, right? Growth rate remained negative for about 3 years, right? 12 quarters, somewhere around between 2 to 3 years. So the shock hits, and the level of output keeps on going down. For the planes, Metz and Wouters, instead, the impulse responses are much less persistent. So, growth stays negative for a few quarters, but then turns positive. These are the gaps closing. So you may have heard that, these DSGE models don't have a lot of persistence, it's all in the shock, but really the exogenous part of this shock, sorry about that again. The exogenous part of the shock is the same. What drives the fact that in this financial friction model, output keeps on going down for 3 years is the endogenous financial frictions that just make it more persistent, right? And you see that for the other shocks that are not important in Metz and Wouters, but are not important in the financial friction model, but are important in Metz and Wouters, you also have a swift recovery. So you get it. Basically, the model attributes to these shocks the Great Recession, and then expects, because of those impulse responses, it expects a pretty fast recovery from it. Recovery that doesn't happen, and so the Metz and Wouters has to have new shocks that explain why output is lower than what it expected, and these accumulate, and at the end of the day, you have output growth of 7%. Okay? Now you may wonder whether the financial friction model always produces a slow recovery to all recessions. So what we did, we went back to the 82 recession, which was driven by monetary shocks, and see what it forecast then. Well, as you can see, same story, black is the data. Here we had a quick recovery, and the model does forecast it. Why? Because as you see, even in this Metz and Wouters model, the impulse responses to monetary in the financial friction, the impulse responses to policy shock is quite temporary, and so you have the forecast that I'm showing. Okay. The other part that hurts Metz and Waters is the forward guidance puzzle. Here I'm showing you the root mean square errors of Metz and Waters with conditioning on federal funds rate expectation and without. And you see that with conditioning, they are much worse, right? The forward guidance puzzle mean is a feature, an unfortunate feature of these models, that when you make anticipated policy shock, the response of the model is really too strong relative to what we observed in the data. And, well, you can tell from these root mean square errors. Okay? For this Metz and Waters model, instead, you know, conditioning or not conditioning really doesn't make a heck of a difference. In the root mean square errors and in the forecast that I showed you, I was conditioning on the nowcast from the blue chip. We do that because, for the obvious reason that DSGE models are not all that great at nowcasting inflation or output growth. And so we learn about the current state of the economy for either judgmental forecasters or models like the New York Fed nowcast. So that's why this first dot is always the same in the bottom root mean square errors. What if we don't? So how much does it matter to condition on nowcast? And here the answer is, as you can see from the top panel, that for output it really doesn't matter that much. Well, obviously it matters for the nowcast itself, but then you go back to pretty much have what you had before. For inflation, it does. So for inflation, the root mean square errors is kind of worse for at least the first couple of quarters, and not 3 quarters, which is not surprising in light of the fact that inflation is more persistent. Okay? And last, I'm going to show you I showed you a very relatively short period, 2011 to 2016. You may wonder, well, what about the whole sample? It could be that the financial friction model was a great model in the aftermath of the Great Recession. That may be a pretty bad one if you look at the whole sample. So these results extend the work of that the Rochelle, Edge, and Lefebvre-Cagnac did in the Brookings paper, as well as my work with Frank Shorfida for the Handbook of Forecasting paper. And the result, this is the root mean square error that I showed you earlier, and this is the one for the whole sample. You see that they go up, because obviously we have the Great Recession in this period. But the result that the model with financial friction forecasts just as good or worse or bad as blue chip still holds true. Okay. You know, there is a perception that that DSGE model have failed. It failed us, and I mean, in a sense, that's true, meaning that they only speak to a very narrow segment of the economy. There's no heterogeneity, there's no information, right, from households or firms in this model, and that's a pretty big shortcoming because it means that this model cannot talk about stuff like inequality, distributions, and that's a problem, and one that we are working to address, hopefully, by taking to the data Hank-type models. But, you know, I want to leave on a positive note in the sense that Metz and Waters promised a model that kind of, you know, works well, a theory-based model, flexible enough to fit the data out of sample, importantly, and useful in many-dimensional policy analysis. And our conclusion for the years that we used it at the New York Fed is that, well, it delivered. So I think that leaves us with optimism that if we go out and estimate models like Hank, take them to the data, you know, we can possibly succeed.